Now, American Perspectives continues with journalist and author James Bovard. Last month, he spoke at Stanford University about government and the erosion of civil liberties. He's the author of Lost Rights, The Destruction of American Liberty.
It's a pleasure to be out here at Hoover. I'd like to thank Tom Hendrickson, John Razian, and the supporters of the Hoover Media Fellowship Program for inviting me out and making my visit possible. Things are different out here in California than they are in D.C. There's a TV camera out there, and if somebody was doing the same thing on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., there would be 3 or 4 guys crowded here just standing right behind me, crowded to make sure that they got their head in the picture. As California's a little more relaxed, it's nice not to be crowded. I want to talk today about freedom and the nature of government. Freedom is increasingly seen as simply another government handout in the same category as food stamps or subsidized subway tokens. Attorney General Janet Reno recently told federal law enforcement officers, "You are part of a government that has given its people more freedom than any other government in the history of the world." This is the type of statement that would have gotten someone tarred and feathered 200 years ago. In the era of the Founding Fathers, it's the mirror image of the Declaration of Independence and the notion that people are born with certain rights. Now freedom is just something that the government gives people, the same as their food stamps. But if freedom is a gift from the government, then the government can take it away time for a reason. The confusion over freedom is tied directly to widespread confusion over the nature of government. President Clinton claims that people have got a duty to think positively about their government. And he's always criticizing cynicism and saying people got to think positively about government. Clinton also should have said that good citizens have a duty to have short memories, because that's about the only way people can think positively about government. Most political commentators have effectively turned a blind eye to the of government coercion. And that's the issue I want to focus on today, because the government is far more coercive than what most people realize. That's something that's not stressed in the media. Instead, the media focuses on the government's generosity, on its caring, and instead is absolutely shocked that people have different attitudes towards the government than what the media has. One example of how the media views the government, a recent series in the Washington Post on trust in government. Now, there are some papers out there that do series of articles that try to examine why some people have got faith in ghosts or faith in witches or stuff like that. What the Washington Post did was do a series on why people don't trust the government. And it was in the same category of shock and disbelief. It was a pretty good series, but there was throughout a sense of wonder by the journalists that so many people think that the government wastes money or lies to them or is violating their rights and liberties. The series nicely documented how badly informed most Americans are about their government. But one thing that the journalists for the Washington Post found absolutely inexplicable was the fact that those Americans who were most informed about government also trusted it the least. This is the kind of the problem this country wouldn't have if more people read the Washington Post. The folks would say, "Oh, it's the government." Politicians have concentrated a vast amount of power in the federal government based on the notion that government is simply a great benefactor. In reality, today, the state is simply a pious fraud. A clear understanding of what government is the first line of defense for individual freedom, and the best way to understand government is to look at some examples of government policy at its most outrageous. Asset forfeiture is one of the clearest examples. Private property marks the boundary between the citizen and the... John Locke, a writer who had great influence on the Founding Fathers, wrote that if someone can come in and seize part of his property, then actually has no property at all. For if a property is not inviolable, then it's not property. One of the most radical changes in Americans' lives in recent decades has been the proliferation of asset forfeiture laws. Federal agents have confiscated over $4 billion in cash, cars, homes, boats, and other property from citizens in the last decade. And in most cases, there has been no proof of wrongdoing. Government seized the property. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have had their property confiscated thanks to these forfeiture laws. It gives insight into what government's all about, because it's an example of naked government power. The government has no duty, no burden to show that a person has violated any law. The only thing a government agent has to do is come in and make an accusation and fill out a form or two sometimes and then seize the property. It's up to the citizen to sue the government and prove that he is innocent and that his property was never misused. However, government is able to use hearsay evidence, gossip or rumors, or some rumor they heard from a confidential informant And that's all they have to seize your car or your boat or the cash in your wallet. Lots of people think about this as federal agents can now seize people's property over 100 different statutes. It used to be asset forfeiture was concentrated under the drug policy. Now it's across the board, from endangered species, all kinds of other areas. And a few examples of what's happening out there now. In Georgia, the FBI seized 3 Mercedes-Benzes from a businesswoman. And the reason was the FBI claimed her husband had used the car phone on the Mercedes-Benz to place a couple of gambling bets, thereby violating federal gambling laws. In a case in Miami, federal attorneys confiscated the $150,000 home of an elderly Cuban-American couple, and the reason was the couple was convicted of holding weekly poker in their home for friends and relatives. There was wagering going on at the poker games, again, a violation of federal gambling laws. That's all it took for the federal attorneys to come in and steal this old couple's house. Central Florida Police Department has launched a program to automatically seize the cash of anyone police consider suspicious who had more than $100 in his pocket. Now, it turns out that being young, black, or Hispanic makes you suspicious. So this is Hispanics have suffered a lot more from these forfeiture laws than have white people, primarily because police are far more likely to go after them thanks to the courier profiles. Another example, Customs Service officials confiscated a $250,000 yacht of a man living in Washington State. His crime, he had sailed to Cuba and given away 15 cartons of dried milk and other care packages to a Cuban group that was trying to feed the hungry. Customs officials claimed that this was a violation of the Trading with the Enemy Act. There's a lot of people that stress the caring side of government, things like that, but some of these cases, last year in Pittsburgh, federal prosecutors devastated Jane Ward after she had fully cooperated with them in testifying to help solve the murder of her husband, John Ward. Prosecutors at some point in the investigation decided that John Ward had been a drug dealer and that all of his previous income was drug profits, even though much of the couple's wealth was from her own business, which she had documented and justified. The federal prosecutors proceeded to confiscate almost all the widow's assets. Federal officials arrived with a truck at the Ward's home and even carted off the family's furniture. It turned out that the Jane Ward and her 3 children were forced to go on welfare, and the family, after having the father murdered, was then come in and stabbed in the back by the federal government. Law enforcement officials are coming in and seizing apartment buildings to punish landlords for not eradicating all drug dealing in the buildings. In July 1992, Cleveland landlords contacted the city police drug dealing in their buildings, wanting the police to come in and stop the drug dealing. Instead, the city lawyers came in and seized the apartment buildings, simply because the landlords had not been able to get rid of the drug dealing since the police themselves have been so successful getting rid of it. It's interesting, if the same standard was used towards the government, private citizens could come in and seize almost all the public housing, since in most big cities, public housing is the center of the drug traffic. And it's interesting that the more sweeping asset forfeiture laws have become, the less effort police actually make to guarantee that the person is guilty. For instance, last year, a mayor of a Utah city announced that police officers would be permitted to personally keep up to 25% of all the property or cash they confiscate from suspected drug dealers. This is a great incentive program. It'd be difficult to design anything that had more overt contempt for due process, the Bill of Rights, or anything. But it's good to the mayor, and it made him look like he's tough on drugs, so he basically gave his policemen a license to steal. There's been a lot of controversy over these asset forfeiture laws in the last half-decade. Not much has been done. The Supreme Court recently heard a landmark case on these policies. The case involved John Bennis, a man who had picked up a lady of the night off a Detroit street on his way home from the steel mill. Police swooped down upon the 2 of them as she was in the front seat of his car. Well, as part of the city's anti-prostitution campaign, the city of Detroit classified his car as a public nuisance and confiscated it. It turns out that the co-owner of the car was Tina Bennis, this guy's wife, and she had not actually authorized him to go out and pick up a prostitute. So it wasn't like she had signed off on it at all. She was outraged, and the family filed suit. The case went through all the courts with some different verdicts, and on March 4th, the Supreme Court shocked almost everybody by holding the seizure. Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote the majority opinion, and the Chief Justice based his decision heavily on an 1827 case that happened to involve a pirate ship. The Chief Justice did not deign to explain the legal equivalence between piracy and certain sexual practices in the 1990s. It would have made for a great footnote. Justice Stevens issued a dissent that vividly portrayed how much arbitrary power the Supreme Court was vesting in police by upholding this decision. Justice Stevens noted that for centuries, prostitutes have been plying their trade on other people's property in palaces, hotels, cruise ships, college dormitories. I'm sure not at Stanford, but it happens some places. Back alleys, back seats, and as far as he knew, not until 1988 had any government ever said the government was allowed to confiscate property that was happened to be one time by a prostitute. It's something that wasn't really noticed of this major Supreme Court decision is that it could pose a threat to public safety. As Justice Stevens noted, if the husband had taken advantage of the car's power of movement by picking up the prostitute and keeping on driving, presumably the car would not have been forfeitable at all. Now, we've heard a lot in the media about the concerns about people using cell telephones at the time that they're driving. Well, compared to that, I mean, there's a much worse potential problem here. I just hate to see the Supreme Court encouraging this kind of thing. Almost all the controversy around the Supreme Court decision has greatly underestimated the actual potential impact, because John Bennett was convicted of gross indecency because the police arrived before the prostitute had been paid. And so it was on that basis that the car was seized. Now, going by that standard, it'd be easy for the police to seize cars of users parked on Lover's Lane. I don't really see how they're posing a great threat to public safety, but a far more expansive ruling than what people think it is. And not only that, but local governments, as usual, have jumped on the bandwagon. As soon as the Supreme Court was announced, local governments added new laws and rulings to further extend their confiscation power. For instance, in the Chicago suburbs, one local city council approved an ordinance authorizing police to seize vehicles whose sound systems are too loud, and another one authorized car seizures for young people who are out in cars violating curfew laws. This is going to make a lot of happy parents. You know, enough that the kid comes back half an hour late, but when he's walking on foot, and say, oh, by the way, I think you should give the police department a call. This is not going to help family relations. Another example, another area that shows the meaning of government is zoning. Nowadays, if a person wants to use their own land, increasingly they have to beg, bribe, or grovel to the nearest bureaucrat. A man's home is his castle unless a politician covets the land the house is built on, or if his house is more than 50 years old, or if he has too many relatives living with him, or if the person wants to add a porch or a deck. Modern zoning laws presume that no citizen has the right to control his own land and that every citizen has the right to control his neighbor's land. Zoning laws have become far more invasive in recent years. Several cities have banned pickup trucks from its streets and even from private driveways. This is known as snob zoning. Wellesley, Massachusetts passed an ordinance limiting homeowners to only 2 live-in servants. I was thinking about moving to Wellesley, but when I heard that, I said, no, I can't afford that. Pasadena, California proposed banning residents from having any weeds in their yards, a policy sometimes referred to as crabgrass fascism. I think that's another city with my lawn care skills I should probably stay away from. Kind of pretexts that the government is using to prohibit people from using their own property are applying. For instance, in Los Angeles, a citizen can be sent to jail for converting his garage into a playroom for his children without the government's permission. In another Los Angeles suburb, the city government prohibited the family from moving into a new home because city inspectors decided the house was painted the wrong shade of white. And the powers are expanding in historic preservation as well. In Boston, historic preservation bureaucrats banned the Catholic Church from altering the lighting, windows, paint scheme, or door and a painting of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary inside the church. The bureaucrats decreed the interior of the church, quote, has major aesthetic importance independent of its symbolism. And thus, the bureaucrats basically proclaimed themselves Pope. This was a case that dragged through the courts for about 4 or 5 years. The Jesuits finally won in this case. However, in many other citizen cases, bureaucrats are still going after churches. Court decisions have said that they shouldn't. They don't care. The essence of zoning is a shotgun behind the door, a pending call to police to drag away someone in handcuffs and bulldoze their home if they don't do what the bureaucrats say. This has happened in New York. It's happened throughout the country. One example, New York City in 1985, a government permission to build a 31-story apartment building. Once the building was already up, the city announced that its officials had misread their own zoning maps and demanded that 12 stories be slashed off the building. As a result of this ruling, the developer was forced to spend $1 million to pay for a 7,000-pound robot to smash down the illegal floors of the building, floor by floor. Maybe it's just me, but it seemed wasteful. It seemed like an abuse if they'd compromised and put a couple officials from the zoning office on each floor and then smashed it down. You know, and it's amazing to see a government make that kind of incredible mistake and then have no liability. It makes such an absolute mockery of any reasonable sense or concept of due process. Another example of government coercion is affirmative action. Politicians and bureaucrats are jamming racial and gender preferences down the throats of American businesses and thereby wrongfully thwarting the lives of millions of Americans. Seeking the best person for the job has gone from being part of the American heritage to being a federal crime. Now, some of the examples out there, I've done a lot of research and called and talked around. One example, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission torpedoed a small metal shop in Chicago, and the reason was the EEOC said the company had hired too many Hispanics and Polish immigrants and not enough blacks. The EEOC pursued the company 9 years and could never produce a single black person who had actually applied for a job at a time when the company was hiring. As part of the settlement, the EEOC forced the company to run advertisements in Chicago newspapers inviting blacks to file claims for compensation, even if they never applied for a job at the company. 451 people responded to the advertisements. It turned out that several of the claimants who said that they would have applied were actually in federal at the time that the company would have done the hiring, but it didn't matter. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission certified everybody as deserving of part of the settlement, even the guys who had been in prison. The EEOC's action essentially destroyed this company's net worth. The EEOC is also doing some creative stuff in sex discrimination. The EEOC has sued Hooters restaurants because they refuse to hire male waiters. The EEOC is demanding that Hooters has a hiring quota and guarantee that at least 40% of all the waiters hired are males. The EEOC claims that Hooters owes at least $22 million in back pay to guys who never even work there. And finally, the EEOC is demanding that the restaurant chain modify the concept of Hooters and make it gender neutral. Some of these bureaucrats raise the hoop pretty high. As with Hooters, as with this Chicago case, the EEOC has demanded the company play advertisement in newspapers for any male who applied or attempted to apply for employment as a waiter. A lot of places that aren't going to take an application from a guy when their restaurant is Hooters. But so there was no way to really document who applied and who didn't, but it didn't matter. The EEOC would be in charge of verifying the authenticity of the claims, but the EEOC's method for that was basically to check the postmark, to make sure that it was sent in prior to the deadline for the claim. I mean, a very efficient way of doing the paperwork. I'll talk a little bit about a more serious area. There's an old saying that in a free society, government fears the people, but in an unfree society, it's the people that fear the government. That's why it's important to say a few words about Ruby Ridge, which is one of the most defining cases of this decade as far as how the government views the American people and how it treats it and what the government thinks it can get away with. The Ruby Ridge fiasco began when an alcohol, tobacco, and firearms arranged to have a confidential informant set Randy Weaver up to sell sawed-off shotguns, thereby violating federal firearms laws. Weaver lived with his wife and 4 children in an isolated cabin at 20 acres on Ruby Ridge in the Idaho mountains about 40 miles south of the border of Canada. Weaver was a white separatist. He had never engaged in violence against other races, but he believed the races should live separately. Because of that, he targeted for a federal firearms sting because the federal government wanted to turn him into an informant to use against the Aryan nations. Once Weaver had sold the shotguns, he was pressured to become an informant. He would not do it, and what he did was just stay up on his mountaintop and refuse to come down. He was sent the wrong date for his trial. He didn't show up, and the government said that proves he's guilty. Once he did not show up, the government launched a massive campaign at him. The U.S. Marshal Service labeled Operation Northern Exposure, and a very elaborate months of surveillance. The Marshals called in the U.S. military to do an aerial analysis. The photos of his cabin were studied by the Defense Pentagon Mapping Agency. They had psychological profiles performed of the entire family, solar long-range spy cameras installed. They even knew the menstrual cycle of Weaver's teenage daughter and planned an arrest built around it. You can't criticize these guys for not planning. On August 21, 1992, 6 U.S. Marshals snuck onto Weaver's property. The Marshals were in full camouflage, wearing ski masks, and carrying submachine guns and other high-powered weapons. 3 agents, 3 marshals circled close to the cabin and threw rocks at the cabin in order to get the attention of Weaver's dogs. There is some evidence that the marshals had planned to kill the dogs that day to make it easier to sneak onto the Weaver's property later on. Once the dogs started barking, Weaver's 14-year-old son, Sammy, and Kevin Harris, a 25-year-old family friend who was living in the cabin, ran to see what the dogs were agitated about. At this point, the U.S. Marshals took off running through the woods, followed by 1 dog. It was pretty clear from a confidential report the government has still not made public that the marshals were panicked by a dog. Marshals later told the FBI they had been ambushed by the Weavers. However, according to the confidential, the marshals chose to stop running and take a stand behind stumps and trees. The confidential report says that Larry Cooper, the chief of this marshal team, told the others that it was bullshit for them to keep running and that he did not want to be run down the trail and get shot in the back. The marshals took up defensive positions and then surprised Kevin Harris and Sammy Weaver as they were running down the trail. The first shot was fired when Marshal Arthur Roderick shot and killed Sammy's dog in the hindquarters, so the dog was posing no threat to the marshal at the time he was shot. Once that happened, there was following back and forth. Weaver came out of his cabin, hollered for his son to come back. Sammy yelled, "I'm coming home, Dad," and he was running back up the trail to the cabin when a federal marshal shot him in the back and killed him. Kevin Harris responded to Sammy's killing by firing in self-defense and apparently killing a U.S. Marshal. Federal agents testified in court that Marshal had been killed by the first shot of the exchange. This later proved that the Marshal had fired 7 shots from his gun during that exchange. The death of the U.S. Marshal sent the U.S. government into a The chief of the FBI's hostage rescue team was called in from Washington and ordered federal agents to shoot to kill any armed adult male outside the Weaver cabin. The federal government knew that the Weavers almost always carried guns when they went outside their cabin. There was bears, there was mountain lions, federal agents, all sorts of things in that neighborhood that posed a threat to them. And it was common for people in Idaho to carry weapons. And with the massive fire, and within a few hours, the 400 government agents were swarming around the Weavers' cabin in the mountains around them, with all kinds of automatic weapons, deadly accurate sniper rifles, the night vision scopes. The following day, Randy Weaver walked from his cabin to the little shack where his son's body lay to say one last goodbye to his son. Weaver was lifting the latch on the shack's door. He was shot from behind by FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi. Now, it's interesting, the FBI director, Louis Freeh, claims that Horiuchi shot Weaver, and the reason was because Weaver was supposedly aiming his rifle at a government helicopter. Horiuchi testified at federal trial that he never even saw Randy Weaver holding a gun. He was outside the cabin, so he tried to kill him. He was just following orders. Besides, there were not any helicopters in that area around the cabin at the time that Randy Weaver was shot. He was shot. He was struggling back to his cabin door. His wife, Vicki, stood in the doorway holding a 10-month-old baby in her arms and calling for her husband to hurry. The FBI sniper, Horiuchi, fired again, hit Vicki Weaver in the head, and killed her almost instantly. Once the bullet had passed through her, the bullet also hit Kevin Harris, who was also going in the door at that time. Once the FBI killed and seriously wounded all the adults in the cabin, the FBI sent an emissary to the Weaver cabin door to suggest that the survivors surrender. There was a large FBI robot that rambled up to about 15 feet from the cabin door and broadcast a call for Weaver to come out, pick up the telephone in the robot's arm, and talk to the FBI. In the following 10 days of the siege, FBI press spokesman kept complaining that Weaver was so unreasonable that he would not even come out and pick up the telephone and talk to them. What the FBI didn't know was that in the robot's other arm was a 12-gauge shotgun pointed right at the cabin door. So here's, I was just seeing his son was killed the day before by federal agents. His wife got killed a few minutes before. He was shot in the back. And he's supposed to trust the government. He's supposed to come out and smile in the face of a 12-gauge shotgun. Maybe that's part of the FBI's good neighbor policy, but it's an amazing what the government expects people to do after they already tried to kill them. Well, Weaver eventually surrendered, and Idaho jury found him innocent of almost all charges and ruled that Kevin Harris shooting the U.S. Marshal was in self-defense. The federal judge in this case, a real conservative law and order fire-breathing guy, issued a lengthy list detailing the Justice Department and FBI's misconduct, fabrication of evidence, and refusal to obey court orders. Senator Specter of Pennsylvania fought long and hard to get hearings on this Ruby Ridge case, but the chairman of the committee, Senator Orrin Hatch, blocked those hearings for a long time. Senator Hatch said publicly that Lon Horiuchi was an American hero, and eventually said that any hearings that were held on the Weaver case had to be structured in a way to boost people's confidence in the government. If some German had said that about the Nuremberg trials, you wouldn't have gotten much out there from the information. But the whole idea that a high-ranking conservative in Congress would insist that these trials on the government shooting innocent people had to be structured in a way to boost public confidence in government, they have high expectations in Washington. Now, some people think that the Weaver case is just an isolated abuse and that time has gone on and it doesn't really matter. That's not what the U.S. government thinks. On March 1st, the U.S. Marshal Service gave its highest award for valor to the 5 surviving U.S. Marshals who were involved in the conflict at Ruby Ridge, including the Marshal Larry Cooper, who shot a 14-year-old boy in the back and killed him, and another Marshal, Arthur Roderick, who started the firefight by shooting and killing the boy's dog. The Marshals received the award, according to the Marshal Service Director, for, quote, their exceptional courage, their sound judgment in the face of attack, and their high degree of professional competence during this incident. The Marshals Director said the men were heroes. This is a case that we'll be hearing more about. There's a grand jury in Washington, D.C. that's currently hearing evidence against 5 FBI officials for their fabrication of evidence and other misconduct regarding FBI action at Ruby Ridge. And the papers are talking today about how the FBI's been ordered to do a self-investigation of what happened when it gave the 400 confidential files to the White House. It's amusing that people would still trust the FBI to investigate itself. It's a real triumph of hope over experience, especially for some of the frauds that have happened in the past with these investigations. 2 quick examples. In late 1992, just after Ruby Ridge, the FBI did an investigation of its action, and the FBI proclaimed in that investigation that Ruby Ridge had been a big success for the agency. The FBI report also concluded that the shooting of Vicki Weaver was justified because it said she'd been out in the front yard waving a gun in the air, possibly pointing at helicopters, shortly before she was shot. No evidence anywhere to support that. It was an absolute fabrication. That's what the FBI said in their internal official report on Ruby Ridge. Now, a second example, starting early last year, the FBI began to take a lot of heat for killing Vicki Weaver. FBI officials put out the word, and one agent even fired off a op-ed piece, which the Washington Post happily printed, that completely exonerated the agency in her killing by claiming that the bullet that killed her had first hit Kevin Harris and then passed through him and then accidentally hit Vicki Weaver. Again, there was no evidence whatsoever to support this. It was an absolute lie. This is the kind of evidence that the government never even suggested at trial, because there was a coroner's report that showed that she was hit first and then he was hit. But this is how the FBI sought to save its image. A similar attitude has pervaded the federal government's comments on what happened at Waco in 1993. The FBI siege, which culminated in the death of scores of women and children on April 19, 1993. The Justice Department spent several years after that fire whitewashing itself and saying that it was basically had not done anything wrong that day. The House of Representatives finally got around to holding hearings last summer on Waco, and it was not encouraging to watch one congressman after another grovel at the feet of federal law enforcement. There were a few that did a good job, but there were so many that simply acted like they were trying to get brownie points with the FBI by saying, "You guys were great, you're so brave." Even when these officials said things that should have knocked people out of their chairs, most of the congressmen and most of the press sat there and nodded sympathetically. A single example. On the final day of the hearings, August 1st last year, Attorney General Janet Reno was asked why she had sent 54-ton tanks smashing into a compound that was occupied by women and children. Why had she, as Attorney General, authorized the use of military force against American civilians? General Reno replied that she did not think of the tanks as being military vehicles. Instead, she thought of them as, quote, good rent-a-cars. This was her actual wording, and perhaps the Justice Department had paid for the damage waiver, so they didn't worry about getting a few scratches or blood stains on the tanks. But this was an absolute bizarre justification by the chief law enforcement official of the country, and yet there was no controversy around it. I mean, what does a person have to say, for goodness sake, before people jump up and say that the government is just, government's policy makes no sense? The American people need a special prosecutor to investigate federal crimes and cover-ups on the Waco and Ruby Ridge cases. It's important to recognize Americans have paid dearly for glorifying the state. Back in 1885, William Graham Sumner said that is only an obscure clerk hidden in some corner of a government bureau. It's time to stop deceiving ourselves about government power and to recognize that government agents every day are doing actions that, if done by private citizens, would be considered the equivalent of a personal declaration of war. Simply because we're members of this society does not mean that we have signed a pledge to become vassals of bureaucrats and politicians. If Americans are going to reclaim the liberty that we've lost, it's time to take government off the pedestal and to put government back in its place as servant, not master. It's time for Americans to stand up and honor the values of our forefathers and reclaim our liberties that have been seized one by one, lie by lie, and fraud by fraud. Thank you.
You want to take questions?
Sure. Questions? Tom. Yeah.
Are the commendations of the marshal be allowed to stand regardless of how this trial goes? Nobody said anything about those commendations, including our inspector, incidentally, as you know.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that the timing of the commendations were not given until after the Senate hearings, and some people said that the marshals had actually gotten the commendation from being able to hornswoggle the senators who were questioning them, because the U.S. Marshals went before the Senate and invented a whole new theory about how the 14-year-old boy had died. Larry Cooper announced that based on their further thinking that they decided that Randy Weaver had actually shot his own son. And this was a whole new revelation, and it was it was questionable because at the time, because the bullet that had killed Samuel Weaver had an upward slant in the boy's body, and Randy Weaver was higher up on the boy was, hills in between where he was, and out of trees. So about the only way that Randy Weaver could have shot his own son is if he'd fired one of those Roger Rabbit bullets that kind of go up and down and spin around trees and stuff like that. There's no evidence that Randy Weaver had a Roger Rabbit bullet. It was an absolute absurdity what the marshals said. However, the marshals did their testimony on a Friday afternoon, and the senators were sitting there watching the clock because the senators always leave town on Friday afternoon. So there was almost no vigorous follow-up. It's pathetic. Yeah, Joe.
Did you go into the motion of Mr. Potts at all in the FBI?
Which I've looked at. Potts is the one who was the person that apparently authorized the rules of engagement at Ruby Ridge. But one thing even more striking to me was that he was the person in command of the operation at Waco, and he was asked, I think by the New York Times on the day after, the Times had asked, why had the FBI sent their tanks in, basically. The FBI finished it off, and Potts said, those people thumbed their nose at law enforcement. Perhaps they hadn't, but you don't use a 54-ton tank against children because some father may have thumbed his nose at law enforcement.
Janet Reno also justified the assault by saying the children were being sexually abused. That was not true. And she said the SWAT team was tired.
Well,
that they had to take action because they couldn't replace them. The United States government's one SWAT team was tired.
Janet Reno has given a number of different rationales for the final assault.
The fact that Potts was promoted to the #2 spot in the FBI, despite his role in both of those incidents, is very significant.
That symbolizes how the FBI thinks that Waco Ridge didn't go badly at all. You know, in target practice, what's not to like? I mean, there's an arrogance and a contempt for the American people there. And maybe something good will come out of it, but I think in Washington, both the Congress and most of the media still has far too much deference to the FBI. Yeah.
Jim, your talk overall reminds me of P.J. O'Rourke's terrific observation that giving power to the federal government is like giving whiskey and car keys to a teenage boy.
Sure. Yeah.
And your comment about the idea that it's government that gives us a degree of freedom, provides us freedom, is in a way analogous to a situation that we find with the difficulty in selling the electorate on tax cut. That is, to convince them that they should get to keep more of their own money. Whereas government certainly, and to a large extent the electorate, has begun to think of taxes as a kind of entitlement, a government entitlement, instead of something that we grudgingly and in a limited way yield for government services.
Yeah, that's a very good example about the taxes, and it's possible to see the great increase in statism in this country by the changing attitude towards taxation. There was fierce controversy in 19 when the income tax was first put in place, and it's been expanded over the years. And it's fine to hear the politicians insist that it's a voluntary program. And the thing that the government does to make sure it's voluntary is take its money before you get your paycheck. That guarantees it's going to work very well, and for cases where that doesn't work, the IRS has criminal penalties. And the IRS has done a lot of things that have sought to maximize fear among taxpayers. They have the high-profile process every April. Darryl Strawberry, the sleeve lady, the hotel lady in New York. It's fascinating to see some of the rhetoric and some of the moral issues surrounding taxation, because it's almost as if people assume that every citizen has a duty to work for the government for 4 months a year, and then the person can start his own life. It's serfs back in the old days didn't work that long for their masters, but taxpayers are working that long for the government. And the surprising thing is it's recognized and hardly ever portrayed as an issue of freedom and coercion. But that's the essence of taxation. So, good point. Yeah.
Have there not been attempts to reform asset forfeiture by statute in Congress? I know that I think Congressman Conyers was right. As you said, the blacks are disproportionately impacted. So he was coming up with something. This was when the Democrats controlled Congress.
Well,
and then Henry Hyde got into it. But what happened to all that?
Basically what happened is that Janet Reno promised to fix the problem herself. And that took all the steam out of the effort in Congress to get the bill, to get the policies fixed. Janet Reno hasn't fixed it, and the outrages are still going on. Henry Hyde, a conservative, did fight hard to get it reformed, which was a surprise from a conservative, but he hasn't stuck with it like he should have, and his bill is somewhat mild to begin with. But it says so much that you have, the last 5 years, ever since the Pittsburgh Press did a great series in 1991, we have known of the pervasive outrages and abuses with these asset forfeiture laws. And there have been a lot of court decisions that said the government was acting far out of bounds. We haven't changed the policies. I mean, it's almost like people have been accustomed to the government agents going around and occasionally stealing a car or stealing a boat or every now and then stealing a house. I mean, the fact that people would tolerate this from a government makes it appear that the people are more servile than one might hope.
I thought a conservative Supreme Court justice would be more interested in property rights. Really. That's what's slightly surprising.
That's true, and there have been some good Supreme Court decisions on this that haven't gone far enough, as well as this terrible one last March. But for some conservatives, as soon as somebody mentions drugs, the Bill of Rights is nullified. And I think that's what's happened with some of these asset forfeiture cases. There's such a paranoia of drugs that it's important to let law enforcement have the powers of dictators to go out and punish whoever they please, even where the evidence doesn't exist. It's much more efficient that way besides. Yeah.
I'm a little surprised about what you have to say about the Congress. It's been a long time since J. Edgar Hoover was clouding men's minds on that subject. And I'm not disagreeing with the torrential attitude. That's a fact, evidently.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit surprising because there usually are some entrepreneurial members of Congress who are looking around for an issue to get themselves some publicity and notoriety, and this would seem to be a good one.
Yeah, there were several. Some freshman congressmen did very well. Bovard, John Chadwick of Arizona, I think Stephen Schiff of New Mexico. One or two others did hard to go out there and try to ask some hard questions of the FBI in Waco, but for the most part, there was just a long line on both sides of the aisle of people bowing and curtsying and saying, "We're so brave," and "Isn't it true that David Koresh had sex with young girls?" And that was a big issue. That's something for the Texas Child Welfare Services to take care of. If you're guilty on that, then they can punish him. Fine. You don't need the FBI coming in to enforce sex laws in some county in Texas. Yeah.
It seems that a lot of the governmental abuses of individual liberty that you're documenting are things that are probably supported to some degree in the very local levels where the power is concentrated in some of the bureaucrats.
Bureaucrats like power. It's always been popular with them.
Do you think that kind of be described as tyranny of the majority on the local level is somewhat fundamental to democracy and to a system that's based on public public opinion.
Well, I'm not sure if I'd say it's a tyranny of the majority. What's happened, I think what's caused so much of the bad government in this century is that people have forgotten that individual rights are higher than the will of the majority, the whims of the majority. People have forgotten that the government, the only reason we have a U.S. government in this country is because we had the Bill of Rights. I mean, the states would never have ratified the U.S. Constitution unless the Bill of Rights had been attached to it. And that's something that makes very clear. The Bill of Rights basically says that these rights that are listed there, and there's far more rights there than what a lot of people would like to recognize today, that these rights are higher than the power of government. And that the only right the government has to is if it recognizes and respects these rights of individuals. So that is where the problem has gone. That's where most of the problems come from. People forgetting that the government, be it a government of a few or government of the majority, does not have any justification to violate those rights.
It seems like in a lot of cases, people are willing to suspend the Bill of Rights when it comes down to an issue that they personally believe in, when they're ready to impose their certain moral vision for their community around them. How do you get people, how do you roll that back, and how do you get people to put the Bill of Rights and everybody's rights ahead of their own vision?
Well, the thing I think that's necessary is to educate people about how much power government now has and how often that power is being abused. Because people have little idea of how far the government power is stretched, be it on food and drugs, or on alcohol, or on guns, or on housing, or zoning. There's 100 different areas where the government is far more powerful than most Americans think it is. And to start out by realizing how far the bureaucrats and politicians have gone is the first step to recognizing why we have to rein them in and decimate their power before they further decimate our liberties.
On zoning, what you did was start off with zoning, which for hundreds of years, people in this country and other countries have tried to protect their property rights by zoning out things they do not want. And then we jump to the confiscation of private properties far beyond that of automobiles, houses, and so forth, and then to actually killing people in Ruby Ridge. Do you see an escalation? What's going on?
Well, I was trying to start out with examples and which people can see and visualize very easily, and then see where it all leads, in deference to government. As far as the zoning, there were deed restrictions going back hundreds of years, and there were all sorts of private agreements that had some of the same beneficial effects that zoning can have as far as preventing directly conflicting land uses right next to each other. However, a 1926 Supreme Court case basically gave a green light to almost anything that the local zoning powers wanted to do. And because of that, the governments started to have a very clear bias. And the Supreme Court gave that green light. Some southern cities, a lot of changes made to land use that had a very adverse impact on blacks, as one would expect from any arbitrary power invested in local governments in the South prior to the 1950s. So there was...
Where are we jumping? I wanted to see what you thought was happening 50 years from now, from where we are now.
Well, it's up to the people today. I mean, can become informed, can become active, can stand up for their rights, and roll back government power. If people don't do that, then we'll soon have as little freedom as...
Condominium rules are government power, or are they the rules of the...
Are you talking like a homeowner association? Yeah. That's a private group people often have the misfortune to live in. Yeah, no, an example of a voluntary type of agreement that a person buys a property in a certain area based on an agreement to abide by certain rules. It's often...
Isn't that a different order of things?
It's an absolutely different order. Yeah. Because with the private rules, which are often noxious and petty, they don't have anything of the law enforcement community. It's like someone's going to have a policeman kick down their door because they don't have the right color of paint on their deck or something like that. Yeah.
Jim, are you very optimistic about this new federalism, the idea of devolving powers from the federal government to the state level? Is checking successes of government, or do you just simply it'll transfer down to a local level? down state level or maybe below.
Well, it's possible something good could come out of it, but I think it's probably going to be mostly a circus shell game. And it's a circus shell game where the people are trying to figure out where the government power is going, and since people can't see it for a few minutes and say it's gone, and all of a sudden it turns up on the local or state government. The answer is to decrease government power across the board and not shuffle it from one part to the other. Certainly, it'd be better to have power has to exist. It'd probably be better to have it in local and state than in federal, but I'm also no fan of powerful state and local governments. Government is the problem, and shifting the power is not going to solve the problem.
Where are the outside people that are supposed to defend our rights, such as a Vigilant Free Press and ACLU and other groups doing things like that with government?
Well, there is occasionally some good stuff in the press. Most press is far too deferential to all government agencies. The ACLU is right on some cases, and it's terrible in other cases. There are groups like the Gun Owners of America and the National Rifle Association that uphold Second Amendment rights. There have been hundreds of property rights groups forming across the country in the last decade. They've done some great work as far as trying to limit the power of local and state governments. Tanks have done some good work. There's not nearly enough being done. And I think the first thing has to be for people to realize how far this government power now stretches.
The ACLU has taken a stand against the asset forfeiture stuff.
The ACLU's been good on that. They've been good on the Fourth Amendment, the protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. There's several other issues that they've done some very good work on. Fortunate that they've got a kind of a schizoid concept of freedom.
Even economic freedom.
Well, it's hard to know what they believe in, because they've also been a driving force behind affirmative action. And the whole idea that the government should be able to dictate the race, gender, and ethnicity of who a company hires or promotes is nonsense. And there's no way to reconcile that with a free society. Right. So very much of a mixed bag. I'm not a member. So, well, and I'll go with that. Yeah.
We can probably expect then more individual and groups that will be defiant of government, more Freeman groups.
Let's not use Freeman as the model for government resisting. I did a story last month that looked at the Freeman and had gotten like $1 million in federal farm loans and had defaulted on those loans, and that was why the government was trying to take the farm. I mean, take $2 million from the government and then claim the government has no authority, it doesn't really help the credibility. And also, a number of the people involved with the Freeman, I think, had other criminal violations. And the Freemen are said to have been involved with bank fraud, check kiting, and things like that. But that's not a good way to protest big government. It's important to have somewhat clean hands. I think that they were also, some of their rhetoric, racist, and we don't need that. That's nonsense.
They did it anyway.
True, but there are also a large number of other groups out there that also have doubts about the government's sovereignty that don't have those type of criminals or racist overtones or other things. So that's one isolated Montana. I think the vast majority of people who have a strong distrust of the government don't share the traits of the Freemen in Montana. Yeah, sorry.
There's one case occurred in Santa Barbara a few years ago that has never gotten much press nationally. I assume you're familiar with it. This was a guy who had a ranch, and the Park Service wanted it.
The Scott case in Malibu.
Yeah, and right. They kind of lived on the ranch with his wife, or his common law wife, I'm not sure which. Anyway, they'd been drinking Saturday night, and they went to bed late. And then early in the morning, they're banging on the door in this remote cabin. And apparently, police, they broke in the front door, and he went downstairs with a gun, and they shot him dead. And because claimed there was going to be marijuana on his property, they never could find any marijuana. They were going to try to take the property for the Park Service that way. This has gotten no publicity at all. I don't understand.
It's gotten some. It should be better known.
It's totally egregious, even.
I agree.
On a par with Ruby Ridge.
Okay, yeah, true.
Or at least in Ruby Ridge, the guy had done something wrong. In this case, they didn't even have any. He had never done anything wrong.
The search warrant obtained by local law enforcement officials that wanted to confiscate that ranch that was worth about $10 million.
That's right. He had been refused.
And afterwards, the justification to the judge for the search warrant was that a DEA agent had flown over and had said that marijuana was growing there. subsequent to this fellow being killed, the drug enforcement agent said that he never said that. He flew over and said that it was the kind of place where marijuana could be grown.
That's great.
The fact is, the owner had never been involved in any drug trade at all, but one of the big scandals that Jim didn't touch on is the law enforcement agencies in some cases are more interested in the money than the conviction. Their budgets have shrunk for a number of years, and I could tell you horror stories of how the interagency fights to get money, and it comes to, as you mentioned, $4 billion, a lot of money. My city manager in San Jose one year wouldn't give me any money for equipment. For the 10th largest city has a police force, and I said, it's traditional to provide them with equipment. And he said, oh, you'll get millions of dollars in drugs. And that's what's driving a lot of the drug. If you talk about Ruby Ridge and Waco, every day in this country, the cops are smashing in doors, shooting up places, and so on in drug raids.
Yeah,
and often it's not often, but often enough, it's the wrong address, not even the right house.
Yeah, I've written it's important to recognize that law enforcement doing no-knock raids is often as inaccurate as a service is in getting mail to somebody. So as far as the Donald Scott case, there was an investigation by the attorney in Ventura County who concluded that the reason why they had done the raid was to seize the property. You're 100% right as far as the facts in that case, and it's one more example of how power corrupts.
It's just an awful example. This poor guy was on his property doing nothing, and they came in and killed him.
I would call him
I'm not sure he act on that lesson.
Well, if memory serves me, if memory serves, there were 19 law enforcement agents who broke in there.
That's right.
From, I think, 7 or 8 different agencies, local, state, and federal. It was like a bloody army going in to one old guy who had been heavily drinking and happened to have an old pistol, which I think didn't even shoot. That's, once again, not a good neighbor policy. Questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
View that is something that the government hands out. This is peculiar to our time. It wasn't always this way, right?
I think it might have been.
What do you this notion? What is it?
Well, it's part of it. I mean, people have got a habit of faking their hand out. I mean, it's not been an accident. The government has tried to maximize the number of people who are dependent on government. With food stamps, you've had a huge drive to go out and recruit more people. You've had it with AFDC. You've had the government begging people to surrender their self-reliance and become a ward of the state. You have it with Social Security, which provides the average beneficiary, I think, with 4 times more than they would have earned based on their contributions and interest. And it's a crushing burden on young people. The government has gotten its hands so far into people's lives. And besides that, the modern political thinking has gotten so far away from first principles. The whole concept of freedom has been shifted to something called a positive freedom, which basically is something that the government is supposed to give you on a silver platter. And it's an absolute oxymoron, and it's the kind of thing that makes the Founding Fathers spin in their graves. But to get back to a clear understanding of what freedom is, because that will help us put a leash on what government does. So
I want to thank you, Jim, very much for a very stimulating, provocative talk, delivered with flair, gusto, and congenial humor. And we'll be delighted to have you here as a visiting media fellow for this week, and we look forward to future interchanges. Thank you for coming.
Remember to take your microphones off, fellows.
American Perspectives continues in a moment with Robert Binstock, talking about aging and public policy.
That was a great program, wasn't it? I'm glad you attended. That was super.
The 1996 convention season has begun.